Geographers, welcome back. So the topic for this video is what I did a live on the other day, and we are looking primarily at the fast biological cycle. Before we go anywhere, just another reminder of the promo offer that I've got on until the end of this month in November. You can lock in your revision process for $9.99 a month over the next 10 months to make sure that your revision process from March 2026 right up until the end of the geography A-level exam is secure and locked in. This will be going up after this month, so lock it in now. Anyway, enough promo, let's crack on with the video. So the last video in the series was looking at the slow geological cycle. So the main connecting factor between these two cycles is the atmosphere store. Remember, once carbon enters the atmosphere, what we said last time, or what we established, was that it can go anywhere. It's like the airport terminal. So once in the atmosphere, now it's free to enter the fast biological cycle. So that is the route between the slow geological cycle and the fast biological cycle. And it's from one process in particular, photosynthesis. Really important process to wrap your heads around in the carbon cycle. So what we're going to be looking at as part of this video is looking at how it can move once in the atmosphere to the oceans and become part of the fast biological cycle there, to the terrestrial biosphere, and how it can become part of the fast biological cycle in there. Let's get cracking. Right, so we're going to start with the oceans. My favourite, without a doubt, my favourite thing to teach about the carbon cycle, just because of how important it is, not only at local scales, but global scales as well. What's going to be essential for your understanding of the oceans and how it works within the fast biological cycle is your understanding of the three pumps. So we're going to go through those. We're going to go through each of those in turn. Okay, so the first one is your biological pump. This is where carbon becomes stored in what's called biomass, and therefore moves through organic matter. Normally we'd associate these pumps with the food chain. So I'm going to tell you how carbon dioxide can move from the atmosphere and moving through the food chain. First of all, we need carbon dioxide to enter the oceans. And the way it does this is via this process here of diffusion. Now, diffusion will take place at a global scale at around 92 gigatons per year. Now, what we do know about the oceans is that carbon can move directly in via diffusion, and then it can be released directly as well. So as you can see, because of the difference between these two numbers, there is a net influx of CO2 into the ocean. So we're at this point now where CO2 is dissolved in the oceans, and this is where our biological pump can now really kick in. So in the surface, we've got these little green things here, and these are known as phytoplankton. Imagine them as like mobile pieces of vegetation in the sea. They're not vegetation, so don't mistake them for vegetation, but they do photosynthesize just like vegetation. And they contribute to around 50% of photosynthesis globally. Not only do they take in carbon dioxide, but they also release oxygen. So once in here, we're at the base of the marine food web. What happens then is it just moves continually throughout the food chain, moving through larger and larger marine organisms. So we call this marine biota. And at this stage here, primarily it's stored as carbohydrates, because these are primary producers, so they are converting sunlight. CO2 is now dissolved, and the nutrients that exist in the surface oceans into biomass, essentially carbohydrates for growth. Then as it moves throughout the food chain, it's increasingly stored as fats, proteins, and DNA. And you've got this kind of biomagnification situation occurring here. So the larger organisms will obviously store more and more carbon. Now, once it's in the food chain within our consumers, remember in the biological pump, these things can move. So they can surface and they can deposit nutrients here for the phytoplankton to use. But also what we know about consumers is that they respire. And that is a route for carbon to move back into the atmosphere, because when they respire, they release CO2. And that's part of that net outflux of CO2 back into the atmosphere. So it's really important when you're studying the carbon cycle that you know about both inputs and outputs. The danger in many students' responses is that people only focus on the this way, how carbon can make its way into a store, not make its way back out. You need to know your inputs and outputs, because ultimately that is what determines balance, that all-important phrase in the carbon cycle. And anything that is cyclical in nature within geography, it's this idea of balance. But you've also got to bring in this as well, haven't you? This idea of a dynamic equilibrium. This exists as a dynamic equilibrium, like so many of the subsystems within the carbon cycle. So that's really important, particularly when you see words like this in the question. regulation of the carbon cycle, maintenance of the carbon cycle. You've got to think in, but you've also got to think out. Okay, so that's your biological pump. Next, onto the carbonate pump. Now remember, the carbonate pump is that kind of singular arm of the slow geological cycle. So that's another way that we can connect the fast and the slow cycles, is through that carbonate pump. So just a quick reminder of what happens in the slow geological cycle. So if you remember, that process of volcanic outgassing is followed by acid rain, and then what happens then is chemical weathering. That chemical weathering process then releases carbonate ions into the oceans. Now some of these will just quite simply precipitate. So they will solidify and then they will sink, and they will sink to the ocean floor. What else can happen is they can become part of the shells of crustaceans, mollusks, or more broadly speaking, marine calcifiers. So anything that will basically create a calcium carbonate shell. So it's often called the inorganic pump as well, and that is because carbon is stored in an inorganic form. So with your biological pump, it was stored predominantly in organic form, whereas this, inorganic. Now what we can then say is that, as you can see, things will precipitate. These things here, these crustaceans, will inevitably at some point die and again precipitate and sink to the ocean floor. The same is true for the biological pump. Organic matter can make its way down to the ocean floor. From this side, it can then go back into the lithosphere and become sedimentary rock. On this side, because it's organic matter, over longer time scales, this is the kind of thing that will produce fossil fuels with that decomposition in anaerobic conditions. So it all depends on the percentage that actually make their way down to the ocean floor. Now there's a minuscule percentage. If you remember from the slow geological cycle, and this is why it happens over these longer term time scales, you'll have remembered that it's only around 0.1% of this stuff here that actually makes its way down to the ocean floor and undergoes that process of sedimentation to become part of the lithosphere again. So what's happening to the rest of it? And this is where we come on to, probably for me, the most important pump within the ocean store. That's right, you've guessed it, it is the physical pump. Now the physical pump goes by another name: thermohaline circulation. Now I've written these two in different colours just to emphasise to you that you can work out what this is about just by looking at the two parts of that first word. You've got thermo, which implies something to do with heat, warmth, if we think thermometer. You've got haline, which is something to do with salt. You'll remember this from coasts when you look at a halocere, that is plant succession taking place in a salt marsh. And then the circulation part is just, obviously, it's moving around and around and around and around, okay? I'm sure you've all seen that scene from Finding Nemo.
Okay, grab shell, dude!
Grab one!
So it's all to do with, within the oceans, there are differences in the temperature of the water and differences in the salinity of the water as well. So the easiest way to explain this is by comparing the poles to the tropics. And again, once we do this, the differences become quite easy to establish. Water here, cooler, water here, warmer. Increasingly saline, decreased salinity. So what's the significance of this? Well, the differences in both of these will determine the difference in the density of the water, and the water over here will be increasingly dense because it's cooler and because it's increasingly saline. The effect of this: downwelling will take place, and this is the thing that kicks the pump off. This is the thing that will start off this entire thermohaline circulation. There have been points in history where there have been points in geologic time where there hasn't been a thermohaline circulation. Cut to way back when there was no ice on the planet and there was very little difference between the poles and the tropics in terms of the temperature of that water. That's the time when the oceans are incredibly still. That was actually the period of time where fossil fuel formation started to occur, because we didn't have as much mixing of the upper and lower layers because we didn't have this circulation. So any dead organic matter that accumulated within the surface oceans was able to very, very slowly make its way down to the ocean floor and accumulate over time, and that's where we get our major oil deposits from. So what's the importance of this? Well, the first thing we have to note is that in colder water you get increased diffusion of CO2. So remember, the relationship between temperature of a liquid and the gas content is that when there's a lower temperature of water, there will be more gas contained within it. It remains dissolved for a longer period of time. So we have increased diffusion of CO2. And the importance of this downwelling process is that it takes this dissolved CO2 into the deep ocean store. You might be thinking, so what? It's all to do with residence time. The residence time is obviously how long carbon remains in a particular store. The residence time in the deep ocean store is significantly larger than the surface ocean. And CO2's in the surface ocean, it's free to kind of move in and out. It can do this this on a daily basis, weekly. There's faster turnover time. Whereas in the deep ocean store, it can remain there for thousands of years. So again, this is really important in maintaining current atmospheric carbon concentrations. We need that kind of increased CO2 being dissolved at the pole and then taken into the deep ocean store, where it's like, okay, pause for a bit before you make your way up to the surface. It's like a holding pen. Now, once you then go into warmer water, the water is less able to hold onto that gas, and then that's when we get the release of CO2 back out into the atmosphere. So it's kind of like this balanced input and output when it goes to the tropics again. But the time scales over which this takes place maintains the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we have, well, that we have naturally before we started to put more CO2 in the atmosphere from the combustion of fossil fuels. So this is your physical pump. Now, it's not only important in the regulation of atmospheric carbon, it's also important because these currents, not only do they transport dissolved CO2 around the oceans, they also transport nutrients. So a classic example of one of these currents is the Humboldt current off the coastline of Peru. And that's an upwelling current. So this is downwelling, this is upwelling. It's an upwelling current that brings nutrients to the coastline of Peru, and that is why fish stocks, outside of an El Nino year, are very healthy. So this supports local economies as well as supporting the biological pump. So 3 very important pumps that are all part of the fast biological cycle in the oceans, and the importance of each, because they're different, is we've got the importance for marine biota and storage in marine biota, where primarily the processes are photosynthesis and respiration. You've got the carbonate pump, which is an incredibly important part of the slow geological cycle. So that pump kind of maintains that slow geological cycle mechanism where carbon can be transported from the atmosphere to the lithosphere again, where it can be stored and held for hundreds of millions of years. And then we've got the physical pump, which is not only important in maintaining atmospheric carbon concentrations because of the differences in temperature and salinity at either end, but it also circulates nutrients and CO2 throughout the globe, maintaining the health of the biological pump. So that's the oceans, obviously an incredibly important part of the fast biological cycle, but we're not finished there, because now we need to cover the terrestrial biosphere. So when you think terrestrial biosphere, there's a number of ways in which we have to study this. We first study it at the most basic level. What is it that's involved in cycling carbon throughout the terrestrial biosphere if we just think about it as this kind of theoretical system? Essentially, we can break it down into 3 very important things. We've got vegetation, we've got soils, and we've got consumers. So the first thing we do, just like we did with the oceans, is we'll start with vegetation, which are the land-based equivalent of phytoplankton. So the route from the atmosphere is exactly the same as in the oceans. We've got photosynthesis, and that makes its way into vegetation. The rates can vary, but it's around 110 to 103 gigatons of carbon per year. So that's quite a rapid flux rate. Once there, it then forms biomass. Now, globally, biomass as vegetation is around 600 gigatons of carbon per year. Once in biomass, there's 2 routes it can then take, because biomass in the form of vegetation or anything that grows that is something like a crop can be then a food source. So it can then move through the food chain into consumers, and that's pretty much exactly the same as your biological pump in terms of it then becomes from carbohydrates stored in fats, proteins, and DNA. The other thing it can do is, as vegetation, it can then die and become part of what's called the litter store. So litter is essentially, you'll see this if you walk around any parks at the moment, it's dead leaves, branches, dead living things if you like as well. Now, a very important process then takes place. So photosynthesis, a very important process. A very important process here is known as decomposition. And the decomposition process takes place by microbial decay. So you've got microbes, bacteria, fungi. So if you walk around any park and you see fungus or what looks like mushrooms on the floor, that is the decomposition process taking place. Now, that decomposition process taking place, respiration is very much a part of that. Whereas this is CO2 in, the loss of carbon to the atmosphere takes place via decomposition, and that's because of respiration that takes place by microbial decay. So once under that decomposition process, it will then make its way into the soil store. Now, the soil store is thought of as, you'll get various sources here, but usually twice the size of the vegetation stores. And this is where carbon is held for a little bit longer depending on the environment. So that upper layer here, is known as the humus layer, and that is where you've got a lot of dead organic matter, decomposed dead organic matter. This is usually around 60% organic matter content. So once in the soils, if these soils are in quite a stable environment, soil will continue to build, and then that dead organic matter will be buried deeper and deeper. So the deeper the soil store, the increase in the residence time. And then obviously, the more carbon that is decomposed and held within these soils, the increased the fertility and the nutrient content, and then that can make its way back into, so over in our soil store, make its way back into biomass. So we have this kind of cyclical ecosystem relationship in the terrestrial biosphere. So that's the basics really of what's going on in the terrestrial biosphere. We have photosynthesis. We can either have consumption where it moves through the food chain, fats, proteins, DNA. We can have litter where it then decomposes and becomes part of the soil store, and then that can cycle back into the biomass because the fertility of the soil determines the degree to which photosynthesis can take place and sequester carbon dioxide into biomass. Now there's a concept that I always teach my students as well. It's very closely linked to photosynthesis, which is known as NPP. That stands for net primary productivity. Now that is an ecosystem's ability to do very much this, CO2 into biomass. Now what we're going to go through next is this idea that obviously the planet is not the same. The degree to which photosynthesis and decomposition and respiration take place in various different biomes and various different ecosystems has enormous variability, and that's because of the fundamental conditions that are required for both of these processes to take place. So let's go through that now. So the easiest way to think about this is breaking up the Earth into your various latitudes. Now there's a lot of crossover here with the water cycle because the degree to which photosynthesis and decomposition take place can be determined by the availability of things like water. There's also that crossover in terms of sunlight and warmth, availability of CO2, availability of oxygen, and the degree to which an area might be waterlogged. So first let's go through what's needed for photosynthesis and what's needed for decomposition. Photosynthesis is probably the easier one because most of you have done it at GCSE. So I always teach my students it's the availability of sunlight, water and nutrients. Decomposition, and for decomposition it's warmth, O2 and moisture. You'll notice that sunlight is not a requirement, so don't mix up warmth and sunlight. You can have decomposition in the dark as long as there's warmth, oxygen and moisture. So the degree to which we'll get variability in these processes will be determined by the availability of sunlight or the intensity of that sunlight. This is where we can bring in a concept that we've not spoken about yet, which is insolation. Now, insolation is the concentration of solar radiation per meter squared. So we'll come on to how that can come into the variability. So let's deal with photosynthesis first. And by dealing with photosynthesis, we can also talk about NPP. We can talk about these two things interchangeably because they are so related. So we'll get very high rates of photosynthesis at the equator. And that's because, if you remember, this is what's known as the ITCZ, where we get very high rates of convectional rainfall. So we've got that abundance of water. There's an abundance of sunlight as well because the concentration of solar radiation is direct. So this is where insolation is probably highest on the planet. So we've got the highest degree of insolation, we've got the highest amount of water. Nutrient content is in abundance because there's high volumes of net primary productivity, and therefore with that we have a large amount of biomass that can produce a large amount of litter that will form part of the process of pretty fertile soil. Now what we have to come on to there is obviously that they're not the most fertile soils in the world, and that's because the abundance of convectional rainfall means that a lot of the nutrients are leached out of the soils. So don't make that mistake of saying that the Amazon has the most fertile soils on the planet. It doesn't. But we do know that we get high rates of photosynthesis here, and this is why this is the location of many of our tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests account for around 30% of global photosynthesis. So where we'll get very low rates of photosynthesis and therefore very low rates of net primary productivity are along 30 degrees latitude. That's because 30 degrees latitude is on the edge of the Hadley cell, and this is where we will have high pressure, and therefore we will have very little water in the form of precipitation, and that's why net primary productivity is low, because this is what is needed for photosynthesis. So plants can't grow without sufficient water. You do get the odd plant every now and again, which is obviously in the form of cacti, some waxy leaves, but it's very, very, very low biomass concentrations here, and this is why we have a lot of deserts in this area here. So it's tropical rainforests versus deserts, and you can literally see this on the map. Mid-latitudes, there will be seasonal variations in the degree to which photosynthesis takes place, and if you remember, that is because the Earth has an axial tilt, and so sunlight or insolation is variable throughout the year. We're currently in winter, so insolation is very low, and that's why there's a lot of litter being created at the mid-latitudes. So it's seasonal, so obviously it peaks in spring to summer. The poles are slightly different. So the poles, we can look at this from the perspective of sunlight. So obviously there's parts of the year where for 24 hours, like in winter, there is zero sunlight at all. Zero sunlight, no photosynthesis. The other thing you've got to think about is obviously the availability of nutrients. A lot of these are locked up and unavailable because a lot of soils are what are called permafrost soils. Now we'll come back to this when we talk about organic carbon content and rates of decomposition. But this is the easiest way to understand variability in photosynthesis. So it will be high here, low here, mid here on average, but it will peak in summer and then go right down in winter. Poles is very low, this, and the unavailability of nutrients. So highest rates here. So you can reasonably respond now to a question about variation in the rates of photosynthesis. So let's now look at decomposition. And you'll start to see very similar trends between the last thing we did on photosynthesis and decomposition, but there are slight nuanced differences in the ways that you have to think about this. So in this area of the specification, you've got to consider that this is the thing that is going to contribute to carbon content in soil. And in any soils, there will be a percentage that is organic carbon and a percentage that is inorganic carbon. Organic carbon can be, you can pick up some soil and you can feel kind of fragments of wood or leaves or something like that. That's the organic carbon content. Inorganic carbon content is stuff like sand. If you've got little granules of sand or little bits of limestone or little bits of chalk in there, that's the inorganic carbon content. So it's not that it's kind of carbon or not carbon, it's just that the carbon is in different forms. So let's first look at the equator. Now there couldn't be more perfect conditions for decomposition to take place. Rates of decomposition are the highest, at 0 degrees latitude on the equator. It is warm all year round. There is moisture all year round, and because of the amount of vegetation, there's very high concentrations of oxygen being produced. So decomposition happens at a very rapid rate. Now, what you might think is that then means that there's the highest concentration of organic carbon. Not the case. Because decomposition is happening at the fastest rate, there is obviously a large amount of organic carbon content, but because decomposition is happening at a very fast rate, that means there's a lot of respiration occurring. So a lot of carbon in organic matter is lost to the atmosphere via respiration in the form of CO2. So there it is, it's floating off. It's no longer in that ecosystem. So again, don't make the mistake of saying that the highest concentrations of organic carbon content are in the atmosphere. They are not. There are large concentrations, and that's because there is this continual provision of leaf litter, and that's the dead organic matter there. But if there wasn't, then there wouldn't be as much organic carbon content as there was. So you'll see that's around mid-range in a lot of diagrams. Here, obviously, it's predominantly inorganic, and that is because there is a lack of biomass to produce the litter that's required to create organic carbon content. So that's nice. That's nice and easy. Mid-latitudes it tends to be higher than the equator, and that's because of the seasonal nature of biomass creation and then litter creation as well, and then the temperature variation. So in the colder months, it's not warm throughout the year. So in the colder months, decomposition really slows down. There's still that high litter provision from the winter months. So because of the seasonal nature, you'll often see that decomposition rates vary, and therefore there's more organic carbon stored within mid-latitude soils. Another reason for this is because the mid-latitudes, because there's quite high volumes of precipitation along a lot of the mid-latitudes and lower temperatures, which means that standing water doesn't necessarily evaporate all year round, we get the creation of wetland. Now that's why I put an NB next to the moisture content. With wetlands, what we do is, because there's an abundance of water there, and remember one of the conditions of decomposition was the availability of moisture, but there's a kind of, that goes alongside that. Too much moisture, i.e. a wetland, and we create anaerobic conditions. Anaerobic means that there's decreased oxygen content. So if you imagine a wetland area just like this, with vegetation in it, what happens is that vegetation still dies and goes to the bottom of the wetland, and now there's very low oxygen content here, which means that the rate of decomposition slows quite dramatically. And what that then means is that the addition of dead organic matter occurs at a rate that is faster than the rate of decomposition. So you get large accumulations of organic matter at the base of these wetlands. Now what that then becomes is a very fertile soil known as peat. So areas in Scotland have very large peat deposits. Now given a little bit more time, and I say a little bit more time, I mean hundreds of millions of years more time, that would then eventually build up enormous heat and pressure, and it would become coal, and that's where coal comes from. But these are incredible carbon sinks. Now it's not that there's no carbon released, because during anaerobic decomposition there is methane created. So, but they still provide that purpose of being a net carbon sink because of this. Yeah, so photosynthesis will lock carbon into biomass. This will then fall and then become a longer term store of carbon, providing the wetland isn't degraded or drained or anything like that. Okay, so that's why in the mid-latitudes you'll see quite high volumes of organic matter. The poles as well, you will see extremely high levels of organic carbon content, and that's because when it's cold, or when the carbon is, or when the soil is frozen in time, decomposition rates go down to around zero. Very, very, very slow indeed, almost unregisterable rates of decomposition. So again, because that happens, there's no respiration from the microbes that will undertake the decomposition, and so your organic carbon content will be very high here. Okay, so it's only through the thawing of permafrosts more recently that we're getting increased rates of decomposition in those areas. Okay, so that is your absolute basics of the fast biological cycle. So what we've covered there is the movements from the slow geological cycle to the fast biological cycle, primarily via the atmosphere and also through that carbonate pump in the oceans. We've split it down. How can we actually move from there into the fast biological cycle? Well, it could move into the oceans, or it could move into the terrestrial biosphere. The oceans, there's direct diffusion into the surface ocean, and then that allows for photosynthesis in the biological pump. Remember, there's the carbonate pump, where carbonates can make their way into the oceans and then become part of the shells of calcifiers or crustaceans or coral. And then there's the physical pump, which moves everything around over time scales of thousands of years. But remember, that is considered fast in the carbon cycle, because the slow geological cycle is hundreds of millions of years. And we've then got the terrestrial biosphere, which obviously is photosynthesis, primarily driven by photosynthesis. The route in is via vegetation, and then that can go in one of two directions. Via consumers, become part of the food chain, like in the oceans, or there can be litter, decomposition, it can make its way into the soils, and then it becomes part of that cyclical vegetation ecosystem growth. We've then just looked at the variability in these processes across the terrestrial biosphere and the interlinkages between the carbon cycle and the water cycle, and how much water availability will affect both respiration and decomposition. Okay, so that brings it to a close. Remember, do check out that deal that I've got on at the moment for locking in your revision process. I think it's a really good deal, if I do say so myself. The next video, or the next live that I'll be doing, is on the unbalancing of the carbon cycle. So everything we've been through so far, because of the combustion of fossil fuels and land use changes that we carry out, what impact does that have on the terrestrial biosphere pumps and processes, and what impact does it have on the ocean pumps? See you again.